All right, let's talk about Dick Cheney. For decades, he was one of the most powerful people, not just in America, but on the planet. But here's the thing about him. Depending on who you ask, you get two completely different stories, two completely different legacies. So on one hand, you've got people like former President George W. Bush, the man who chose Cheney to be his vice president. To him, Cheney was a patriot, a friend, one of the finest public servants he ever knew, the guy you wanted in the room for that calm, steady counsel when things got tough. But then you have the other side, and it is a world apart. For many people, like the Iraqi writer Sinan Antoon, Cheney's name isn't about public service. It's about chaos, destruction, and a war that he says completely shattered his country. So that's really the question we're tackling, isn't it? How can one guy be seen as both a dedicated statesman and a war criminal? To figure that out, we've got to look at the man himself. So let's get into it. You know, to really get a handle on the kind of power Cheney had as vice president, you have to realize he didn't just show up in Washington in 2001. No, he'd spent decades building that power. He was a product of the system. I mean, look at this. Long before he was VP, Cheney was the quintessential Washington insider. He was the youngest ever White House chief of staff at just 34 years old. He spent a decade in Congress. Then he was Secretary of Defense for the first Gulf War. So when he got to the vice presidency, he already knew exactly how every lever of power worked, because he'd pulled them all before. But of course, it was his time as vice president, right in the shadow of a huge national tragedy that would really define his place in history and, well, become the source of all the controversy. After September 11th, Cheney was right at the center of Sheep in America's response. He was a major voice for a really assertive, kind of muscular foreign policy. His argument was, look, an attack this extraordinary demands an equally extraordinary response to protect the country. And a huge piece of that response was Iraq. Cheney was one of the first and loudest voices pushing for an invasion. He went on TV again and again, publicly arguing that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that he was linked to al-Qaeda. But here's the thing that changes everything. The main reason given to the public for going to war, the WMDs, it turned out to be false. No weapons were ever found. And that one fact would cast a shadow over that decision forever. The consequences of that decision would ripple out for decades, not just in the Middle East, but for the soldiers who served and in some pretty bizarre ways right here at home. I mean, just look at the human cost. It's staggering. A study from Brown University's Watson Institute estimates that over 800,000 people, 800,000, have been killed by direct violence in the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other post-9/11 conflicts. And for veterans like Christopher Goldsmith, who signed up right after 9/11, that cost was deeply personal. He talks about coming home from Iraq with more than just PTSD. He calls it a moral injury. You know, that deep psychological wound you get from being part of a war you eventually came to believe was unjust and started on faulty intelligence. And the controversy wasn't just about foreign policy. There was this one bizarre, almost unbelievable incident that for a lot of people just came to symbolize the kind of power and impunity that Cheney seemed to operate with. So get this. Cheney is out hunting quail in Texas, and he accidentally shoots his 78-year-old friend, Harry Whittington. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that after Whittington gets out of the hospital, he is the one who goes on TV and publicly apologizes to Cheney for all the trouble the incident caused. I mean, for critics, it was the perfect metaphor for a world where they felt Cheney never faced consequences. Okay, but the story doesn't end there. In fact, it takes a final and, honestly, pretty surprising twist. So after being a hero, an absolute icon of the conservative movement for decades, Cheney suddenly found himself an outcast. And his biggest critic wasn't some liberal from the other side, it was the new leader of his own Republican Party, Donald Trump. It was just a total 180. The guy who basically defined what it meant to be a Republican for one whole generation found himself completely against the next one. He eventually called Trump the single greatest threat to the American Republic in its entire history. And this led to a complete and total break. He fiercely defended his daughter Liz for her work investigating January 6th, and in the end, he even endorsed a Democrat for president. It was wild. He started getting praise from some of the very same people who'd spent years calling him a monster. So, how do you even begin to sum up a life that was so polarizing, so consequential? What's the final verdict going to be? Well, at his core, you have to understand that Cheney was a true believer in an idea called neoconservatism. It's basically the belief that American power isn't just a tool, but that it should be used to reshape the world to promote democracy and American interests, even if that means using overwhelming military force. So when you look back, it's like Cheney played three completely different roles. For years, he was the hero to the right and the absolute villain to the left. But then, in his final act, he became this unlikely critic of the new Republican Party, and it just scrambled all the old labels. And according to his biographer, Cheney himself was totally unapologetic, right to the very end. He didn't shy away from his controversial image, he leaned into it. He apparently actually liked it when people called him Darth Vader, because to him, it meant he was powerful and influential. So what's the bottom line here? The real heart of Cheney's legacy comes down to this one belief, that in a dangerous world, taking decisive, aggressive, even preemptive action isn't just an option, it's a duty. And the whole debate about his life really boils down to whether you think the results of that belief made the world safer or a whole lot more dangerous. His career spanned half a century and literally reshaped the globe. So what was he? A principled statesman who did what he thought was necessary to protect his country, or a ruthless operator who led a nation down a disastrous path based on lies? The final verdict on Dick Cheney is far from written. That's the question historians are going to be arguing about for a long, long time.